that. So Karena, take it away.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Murray. And I want to thank RLB for this invitation and the opportunity to share my hope for a wonderful future with a uniquely placed audience. You guys are people who have made it their life's work to make a difference in the lives of others. As I reviewed the complex group of organizations that you'll serve, the attendees cover a huge spectrum, the full complexity and diversity of life here in Canada. We have organizations working from the very young right through to old age. We cover recreational activities from bowling to skating to golf. We have law and order, faith-based organization, churches, schools, and a number of volunteer groups from hospitals to environmental stewardship. The common theme, though, that ties all of you all together is your interest in care and community. And to all of y'all, I want to say the message I want you to walk away with from today is this. You have a unique vantage point. You have a unique vantage point on what society is and what society needs, and therefore you have the ability to shape the Canada of the future. Yeah, the next slide, please. Give me a second, I just need to, oops, I've lost my Zoom screen. There you go. Hello. Hi, thank you. Next slide, please. So, I recognize that we live in very interesting times. Here we're celebrating the 10th NPO seminar, and instead of being huddled over coffee and croissants, all of us are here in this Zoom conference. I recognize that some of you all may have to step away from this seminar, so I'm actually reversing a little bit of my slides and putting my contact information right up front. My name is Karena de Souza. As Murray mentioned, I'm a strategist. My focus is the future of work. My website and Instagram presence, where I'm a little more present than Twitter, is Tilt the Future, and that's the same name as my podcast. The podcast focuses on the future of work, primarily addressing Generation Z. And you can find me in LinkedIn under my name, Karena de Souza. If you like what you hear, please feel free to contact me and share my message. I tend to talk primarily to parents and educational institutions, but I'm most willing to bring this message to any group, any organization, either in presentations or strategy and workshops. Now, we're going to have a lot of information to cover in the next 30 minutes, but I hope to do so quickly so that we can use our time in Q&A to actually delve into how this topic impacts your organization. Next slide, please. We have 3 topics we're going to cover today. They're rich. The first is going to be the future of work, and primarily how it can impact your client base, the communities you serve, the communities you work with, the people who work with and for your organizations. Then we're going to move into a discussion about the gap and the specific set of skills we need to be able to walk our way through this transition, particularly right now with this focus on COVID. And then I'd like to take you into discussion on tilt. How can we change the future? The answer is a little bit at a time. So if you look closely at this picture that I've picked out, it's actually a rich mosaic. It's a memorial to John Lennon. You'd find it in Central Park in Strawberry Field. And I like it because if you look at it very closely, it's made up of little bits that come together to inspire us. We are all those little components of society. But it's your organizations that bring these together and make up the sum of the parts to make it look more beautiful through your vision. So each time you look at a set of tiles, whether it's in the subway or your kitchen backsplash or your shower stall, I want you to bring your mind back to this discussion and this conversation and to recognize the difference that you are able to make in the world. Next slide, please. So give me just a second. Sorry, I just need to rearrange my screen here because I cannot see the Zoom screen. There we go. Excellent. So this is a slide that represents the 4 major pillars of my work. In 2015, when I started doing the work on the future of work, there was just one giant pillar, and it was technology. I was debating robotics, AI algorithms. But as I started delving into this technology acceleration, I realized that this was going to be a very different scale of technology and its impact on society. We were not talking about the things that had made the difference for my parents or my mother, where she moved from the mechanical typewriter to the electrical typewriter to the computer keyboard. This is on the scale of the plow and the printing press. I started realizing that this was going to be a big transition for society. And that is exactly why I'm excited about including all of you all in this conversation. Now, whilst I was doing all this research, I had 3 young children at my dinner table. They were aged between 12 and 17, making core career decisions for themselves. And so here's me, the traditional immigrant mom, and I'm steering them away from all the solid career prospects that typically we would have pushed them towards. But there was something else going on around 2016. I don't know if you recall, but there was this huge focus and this significant uptick in mental health issues for young adults. As I extrapolated the shift that was coming, I envisioned our society 50 years from now. And I didn't want a mental health crisis to be the diabetes epidemic of the future. I couldn't imagine the pressure that was going to place on our healthcare system. So let's see if you can relate to this. I believe that the way we speak to young people really makes an impact. So about 2 years ago, I was posting a video and I'd done about 7 takes. I loved the content, but every time I did the replay and I looked at myself on screen, something felt off. And I kept hearing this voice in my ear. It's like, seriously, you're going to go on camera with your hair looking like that? And I was like, that's not my voice. That's my mother's voice. But she wasn't in the room. She was a whole ocean and a continent away. And yet she was influencing the way I was thinking about how it presented on screen. So this is very important because the words that we hear when we're 15 echo in our heads when we're 50. Now, why do I bring this up in context of for discussion on the future of work? It is very important that right now, as we talk to young adults, that we do not use phrases like, you will only be successful if you have a full-time job with a pension plan. Because all I can imagine is 30 or 50 years from now, a whole bunch of 50-year-olds sitting around with a lot of unresolved and misunderstood guilt because they haven't delivered on something that was actually totally out of their control. Our words matter. And a number of your organizations actually deal with young people. And that is why I think you're in a position to make a huge difference in this conversation. Then we move on to foundation skills. The reason this is important is because they actually make a difference to how we manage with well-being. I am having a huge issue with my slides right now. Give me a second. There we go. So if we look at the 4 pillars that I work with, in the past 2 years, there's been a significant amount of work that's come in to handle the other 3 pillars, but not many people are talking about transformation. And that's why I'm going to use this presentation to address that specific space. We're going to talk about what the nature of work is changing, how fast it's happening, and the very skills that can help us manage through this transition. Next slide, please. Now, if I'd been with you in person, you'd probably have picked up my business card. And one of them would have been this bright yellow roller coaster. You'll probably see it on my website. So why did I pick a roller coaster? I picked it because I want to force the conversation about the core difference in the nature of work. When I started work, we had a very clear career ladder. If you did everything right, you had a good chance at staying with one organization long enough and climbing the ranks. But this is no longer so. For people right across the age spectrum, our work life has begun to feel more like a roller coaster ride. And this has only become more apparent with COVID. But I have a strategy. If I had brought you into the workplace and told you there was a ladder, and then instead put you on a roller coaster, you're going to be very confused. But if instead I tell you right from the start that this is a roller coaster, I'm now setting up expectations. This is going to be a big change because if we bring people in with the right mindset, they begin to enjoy the ride. They begin to anticipate what's coming. I actually expect that this is actually going to be more of a problem for us leaders because we have grown up in the old way and we're going to find this conversation a little bit discordant. Now, let's also go to the elephant in the room, which is COVID. Many others are going to touch on this subject, so I'm not going to dwell on it. But you will probably read and now notice conversations in the press that talk about COVID being an accelerator for the future of work. Everything that I am seeing happening right now is something that was already in the works. If it wasn't going to happen by 2030, by 2035 at the latest, these are situations that I had imagined. COVID has just seriously put all of that on fast forward. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the future. But I'm actually going to do a little bit of a bait and switch here. And I'm actually going to take you on a history lesson. This is the moment when things started coming together for me, when I was plotting the strategy and focusing on technology. And I began to realize that the future of work was really not a discussion about technology, but it was actually a discussion about era change. And that's when things started to make a little more sense. This is a change that would see us moving, just as we had from the agricultural villages to the dense cities that we see today. Now, I know many of you are wearing a smartwatch and probably multitasking, looking at your smartphone whilst you're watching this presentation. Well, that indicates another shift that's going to happen. Next slide, please. The reason that the future of work right now feels so uncomfortable is because we're actually in the middle of creating a new social contract. These shifts are much more foundational, which is why we feel we're on a roller coaster. The last time we were at this spot was when we switched from the agricultural era to the industrial era. In the agricultural era, everyone worked together. There was no such concept as a teenager. You grew up in height and brawn, you took on more responsibilities around the home and the farm. As you aged out, you went back to helping in the home. You were always looked after. Your day started when the sun came up and the livestock needed feeding. Your year was set by the seasons and the crop cycles. When the earliest whiffs of the industrial era were around in 1690, when the first steam engines were being experimented on, but the industrial era really didn't start hitting with force until the mid-1730s when looms were mechanized. And from then it marched steadily on through the 18th century. Different manual activities started getting mechanized, from oil refining to bread baking. And now people were housed in windowless factories. And we start to see time defined not by the sun, but by a clock, which defines our shifts. And our year was defined by this thing called a calendar. Our social contract had changed. And so it is right now when we're moving into a new era, an era that we can actually see where we have 5 careers in one lifetime. Things are changing again. Next slide, please. So to help myself understand this, I created this matrix. I was driven by this quote. By the year 2030, 50% of all the jobs we know will have disappeared. So I had parents coming up to me all the time asking, with all this uncertainty, what job should my child do? And I really didn't have an answer for them. So instead I would share this matrix and I'd say, see, all those dashes, that's a job waiting to be created. Now, it's difficult for us to imagine that the structure of society can be something other than what we are currently used to. But let's study this slide a little bit, bearing in mind that with Maslow's hierarchy, in the end, all our needs get met. But here we're going to look at how it happens. Now, we've already discussed time, a core concept, and how that has changed. But let's wrap our heads around something that's more easy to understand. Pensions. If all of you were in the room in front of me and I asked you, what was your fail-safe pension plan in the agricultural era? You'd most likely have been screaming back at me, have more kids. But did you know that it wasn't until the 1930s 200 years after the industrial era had started, that we moved into a mindset of pension plans. And much of that had to be legislated, like healthcare. So it wasn't something that everyone always had. People congregated in cities, so we started using schools to educate. Previously, your career was what your father did, and your education was to apprentice patiently by his side, absorbing the complex angles if you were a thatcher, or the innate skill if you were a stonemason. School came in the industrial era to serve two purposes. We had a next population of worker who was too young to work in the factory, but they still needed to be trained. But interestingly, another side reason was as crowd control, because suddenly we had this new generation that were called teenagers causing trouble because they were roaming the streets unsupervised. So all these are things that came in to solve for problems that didn't exist before. And right now we're going to be in a similar state. Next slide, please. I wanted to have this discussion with you about what all those issues were, because now we're coming into a discussion on the nature of work. I think you're beginning to see, hopefully beginning to see, how the future of work is not purely about technology. The future of work is how the nature of work is going to change. And the nature of work is not going to change in a vacuum. This is not an economics or a workplace issue. It is actually being bombarded by everything that's happening around it. You're going to see issues like new technology, which are simultaneously making our lives easier, but also taking away simple, repeatable tasks, the very same entry-level positions that gave most of us our first foot on that career ladder. Climate change is going to have a significant impact, not purely in the extreme events that we all experience, but also in the number of climate refugees that we're going to be seeing coming in from other parts of the world. Population. I wanted to touch on this. I actually had a slide about it. I was running short on time. Do you know that the point at which the world's population crossed 1 billion people was 1800? That was like the beginning of the industrial era. It took 130 years before we crossed to 2 billion people, just before the Second World War. But in my lifetime, the early 1960s to now, we've actually gone from 4 billion to an estimated 8 billion, which we expect to hit in 2024. Can you imagine that number of people? Well, that is actually also going to play into this conversation because we have more people chasing fewer jobs. And that is another reason we feel like we're on this roller coaster. That population is also impacted by the fact that we have made significant inroads into medical health, which means that people are living longer. They're living longer, they're living vibrant lives. So we need to pull that into the conversation. We're going to have conversations around food security. So all of these, as you can see, all of these are individual components, but they all impact how the nature of work is changing and how we start thinking about it. Next slide, please. So how does this impact you? You're going to see an increased number of people looking for your services. There's this sense of unease. They're going to come across all generations. You're going to have a diversity of culture, of educational background, but there's going to be a core element that seems to be consistent, and that is that they're unsettled and confused. Next slide, please. COVID has certainly impacted us a lot. Seniors are carrying a significant burden of loneliness. They're beginning to access services that they previously may not have needed. In fact, I think one of the things we're seeing in these times is that we have asset-rich older people, but they're cash poor. And they find themselves in this very different position of needing support, whether it's medical care, medications, or simple grocery deliveries. But it's also a time when they're time-rich and connection-starved. And I think there might be an opportunity there when you're talking about volunteer work or donations to think about how we can leverage that. I know Glenna is going to make that a part of her conversation. Next slide, please. I want to spend a little bit of time on this slide because as I went through the roster of organizations represented here today, many of you are dealing with young adults, either in the areas of education or care or even recreation. Now, while my message to everyone today it's for everybody today, it is most urgently directed towards you. You might have realized that I focus my future of work discussions on parents and Generation Z. That's because very few people were addressing them. Did you know that in an interesting twist, a survey done this time last year with Canadian university and college students actually positioned parents for the first time as their most major career influencer? So that makes it very important that we have this conversation about how the future of work is going to impact us with parents and young people. In your role as coaches, teachers, members of organizations, I would like it for you all to share this idea of the changing nature of work. How is it going to change? Who you are and your purpose is going to be much more important than what you do. We don't yet know how things are going to be, but it really does impact your mental state. You should always be, so what are the things that we do know about the future of work? We know that you're always going to be in a position where you have to learn. There's this new phrase that's come out that's called K to gray. And your presence here, for instance, is an example of this fact that you should always be thirsty and hungry for new knowledge. The other thing that's going to significantly change is that you will always be in charge of your own career. You cannot rely on anybody else. The third part where it's going to change is this focus on EQ skills, not over IQ skills, but actually rising in a similar level of importance. These are things like confidence, courage, creativity, communication. And this is going to be paramount as you step into this new normal. So let's come to the workforce. Here, we're going to talk about the people who work with you and for you. I could flood you with information on this screen. Half an hour is not enough, and not enough time to share what I've learned in 5 years. But let's focus on this word gig, which tends to be a trademark of future of work. And I want to focus on that because it's becoming the order of the day. I don't know if you know that over 55% of Google's workforce is contract-based in some way. Now, if an organization with that much of a trade cap can actually have that much of a focus on, or that much of a blended employee base, it is an indicator for where things are going in the future. By 2030, we'd expected over 80% of the workforce to be working in some kind of gig style situation. What does this mean for your worker? And what does this mean for you? And what does this mean for us as a society? Well, one of the things that is always in my mind is if we have people working gig work, that means there are significant portions of time where they may not be working for cash. I can see that as playing significant games with our head. And I would therefore like us to be working towards a redefinition of the word work, as work being something where we provide value, not work being something where we get money passing our palm. The other place where it's going to impact us is in government. If government doesn't have a forecastable cash flow from taxes, income taxes, how are they going to cover things like healthcare and pensions? So you begin to see why I have those elements on that matrix that we talked about before. We will still have a lot of people in full-time work, and we're also going to be going towards volunteer work. Now, a lot of these things have been in place for a while, but we're beginning to see it accelerated now, especially in times of COVID. Next slide, please. I'm going to gloss over this slide really quickly, but today's Zoom event is pretty much indicative of what's happening right now. We're beginning to have a workforce that is very blended. We've got local on-site, we have remote, and increasingly we're having access to an international workforce, especially if we are working with digital. But one of the things here that I want you to pay attention to is how this different work style is going to need us to start focusing on mentoring as leaders. As leaders, I want you to move away from micromanaging and more to empowering your work staff. Next slide, please. COVID, of course, is going to throw a huge wrench into this work. One of the things that we're beginning to notice is the sense of process fatigue. I mean, the very act of having to suit up repeatedly, the way we're changing our workflow is something that needs a stage of adjustment. Next slide, please. And then there is the group of you who are focused on nature as your client. Climate is going to impact all of us significantly in the near future. As Marie mentioned, it's a pet issue for me. But as I mentioned in the population discussion, we can see that the increased number of population is actually going to put a huge amount of pressure on our natural resources. So we really have to pull together to solve for this. Now, if your organization is looking for a project that has a longer time horizon, I will offer you the same suggestion I offer students right now, which is look at the problems that are difficult to solve. Climate is one of those. If we start defining work as gathering a body of knowledge to solve a particular problem, then there's almost a guarantee that we're still going to be at this game for the next 10 years. Next slide, please. So let's come into this discussion about the gap. Next slide, please. I'm going to take you back to that first slide that I had on the change of eras. But now I'd like to bring your eye to a few details in here. Ignore the dates on here because I think I missed an updated slide to the team. But look at those arrows. Can you see how long and skinny the agricultural era was into the industrial era? But now that arrow moving from the industrial era into our new era is a little blunter. Things are moving faster. We're having to make adjustments faster. But what is the other thing I'm trying to do here with showing you these two sets of gaps? The time between the dawn of the industrial era and the point at which we started putting in pension plans was almost 200 years. As someone said to me the other day, I never realized that whole generations lived within this gap. Whole generations lived in this time of shifting where you're not clearly in the agricultural era and still not fully in the industrial era. Well, we're kind of seeing that play out again right now. I was talking about my kids earlier. One of the reasons this hit me like a ton of bricks was my kids were being brought up with an education system that clearly served the industrial era. But I could see from even the summer jobs that they were going for that we were already moving as a commerce focus into the new era. So they were being raised in one era, but actually having to live their lives in a new one. Well, this space in between, this is the gap. It's that space where we don't know which way is up. And it's a very specific phase. Most people don't talk about it, but we experience it all the time. You experience it in the way it takes you to adjust back when you've been at vacation. There's an actual phrase for it. It's called liminality. But imagine that sense of displacement, slight displacement. We're all doing it. We're doing this on a global level. So this is why I'm sharing this particular piece of information with you, because once you're aware of it, you actually prepare for it and you can engage with it. Next slide, please. So what are the indicators that we're in this gap? If you read through them, many of these will seem familiar. There's a lot of identity confusion. There's a lot of disruption. There's a lot of new stuff happening. But the bottom one is the one that I like the most. The biggest change is that we do not have a map any longer. A map tells us where others have been. Now we're all in a position where we are creating that map. We're actually working on compass. And that is why having a sense of purpose and a sense of direction is going to be very important in this short space of time. Next slide, please. So I'll bring you back to that matrix slide. When I first put it out, it had all those dashes. And in the 4 years since I've been using it, I've started filling more of these components. But I put question marks in front of them. And the reason is that this, even though this looks like a solid column, it is actually a discussion, a journey over a span of time. And if you look at something like transportation, the very first cars were actually just horseless carriages. But over the span of the industrial era, they've evolved to look the way they do now. Well, the same is true for everything from education to our career paths. We can extrapolate what we think is going to happen, but everything is evolving around us all the time. People are innovating, people are testing. So what you're seeing right now is really just the first iteration of what the future of work is going to look like. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way it's going to end up. So what does this mean for you? In the services that you offer, you're probably first going to be seeing a lot of people who are still trying to figure themselves out. So you may want to adjust and expand your services to accommodate for that. But the other part is, if we're in this state of experimentation, why does that not apply to you? So I would recommend that as you are considering what your organization is doing, if you're considering what your organization could do, don't hold on to your processes and your purpose too rigidly. Be willing to iterate. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for this gap? We're most likely going to be in it for the next 5 years, most certainly going to be in it for the next 5 years. How do we look at it and how do we manage it? Well, we know we're going to be in a significant gig economy. We know we're going to have climate impacting us. I'm hoping that we're going to start a redefinition of the word work and start talking to other people about how we change the conversation from unemployed to upskilling, because I want that change of mindset to be out there in the workplace, especially for young people. We're going to see rapid changes in technology. How can you leverage this knowledge? Well, I noticed there was, like, for instance, a golf course in this group that's attending today. Maybe you can partner with the youth in the Y program that's also attending. Maybe we can use that young talent who have their pulse on technology to design something like the drone programs. If we can cover your course, your golf course, with a drone program, and then use those kids to partner with seniors, teach them the new technology, then maybe the seniors can start doing virtual foursomes with their old buddies, and we can use this situation to increase more socialization and exercise. We can also create that mentorship relationship across all these different generations, which is going to be very important. The youngest generation is very knowledge rich, but that's because they know how to use Google. Us older folks, a little more wise, because we know what questions to ask Google. This is a very, very important point. Access to knowledge doesn't mean that you know how to apply it. And so the opportunities that the groups out there that provide mentorship are going to be a huge part of the success of going forward for Canada in how we manage the future of work. Next slide, please. So we come to our final section, tilt the future. Why did I pick the word tilt? Because trying to redesign yourself, reinvent yourself can seem like a huge, huge task. But in every instance, we can actually take tiny steps, testing out each idea. And that's another reason I like this picture. I like the fact that all the organizations that are represented here today actually in some way have grown in response to a gap. Even my choir, for instance, right? So you've got Habitat for Humanity, you've got the Y, you've got Big Brothers, Big Sisters. All of them noticed something that was missing, and they came in and solved for that problem. So my invitation to you is that as we move into the future of work, with society being one of those core issues that we're going to have to work towards, I see your population, all of you all here in the audience, as having a unique vantage point on the expanding and developing need of your client base. You have always been in this space where you can look at where they are going. So now, is it possible for you to use that information, this knowledge base that you have, and not only talk about where they have gone and fill in that gap, but actually design where they're going? We're going to have to redesign society. So my invitation to you, and my hope for you out of this conversation, is that you see yourselves as leaders. You do not wait for the future of work to be designed by government and corporations and come in to fill the gap. But you'll actually take the conversations that you'll have developed over the past 20 years and start leading with it. reinvent your organizations to meet that. Next slide, please. So we've covered some major ground, hopefully quickly enough. I know many of you all are very tired of hearing the phrase, the new normal. So I think we're going to switch it a little bit and actually talk about what is your next now? What is the thing that you can manage in the space of the foreseeable future? What do you have control over? So we've talked about the future of work and how it's an era change and a new social contract. We've talked about the gap, which has brought a lot of uncertainty, and we don't quite have solid ground beneath us. And we've talked about how we can actually have influence over what we do in the foreseeable future. We each have agency. We each have control. And so my invitation to you is to focus on this next now. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you, Karena. We do have a few of them coming up in the chat. So I'll start with the first one. The question may be outside of the scope of your discussion today, but as we've experienced 8 months of COVID and change in the way we work, i.e. working remotely, I've heard about and understand there's a shift happening where people are deciding to live, moving to smaller communities and out of the big hub cities. Have you heard anything about how this will impact technology, all types of services, and anything else that you may be aware of?
Well, thank you for that question. And yes, it's something that I actually had imagined about 3 years ago when I started seeing this disparity between these huge, large cities and all this land in between. And it kind of confused me because so much of the work that I had been doing was remote. And I began to imagine a place where we spent less time commuting and more time with our families. COVID has kind of given us a recipe for how that could be possible. And why is this so important? Because I think that as we move forward, if we're able to be in control and create these communities where your school, your place of worship, the grocery store, all these organizations work together, we actually create a bedrock for our young generation coming up. One of the things that I didn't address quite clearly in my presentation because there wasn't enough time is how important it is to have good fundamentals. The more we can invest in young people and give them confidence, the more it gives them the courage to go out there and experiment and test. And I think that is something that we need to concentrate on. We've had issues in the past couple of years where, in response to 2008, entire towns, especially like in Nova Scotia, for instance, would have moved towards serving one particular industry. Let's say, for instance, call centers. Well, now as new technologies are coming in, the robot calls, for instance, those call centers are not needing the number of people that they did before. Which sounds great if you're one call center and one organization. But when it starts impacting a whole community, you begin to see how those people have to go searching for work elsewhere. And that's when it becomes an issue, because now you're actually fraying at the elements of society, pulling apart these communities that had been structured before. So I do hope that we can test something that is a little bit of both, which is we primarily use all this land that we have that's in between the two coasts, spread out a little bit more, but also given the technology advantages we have right now, recognize that we can partner with people right across the globe, really. I hope that kind of answers the question.
Yeah, great, thank you. We have two more. I may skip over the second one for a moment. I think part of it may be covered by Dana's presentation, and if not, then we'll kind of circle back to you afterwards, or her. So I'm going to skip to question number 3 here in the list. Study by recruitment firm Hayes Canada, which looks at the sentiments of business and the labor force, has found a significant disconnect between Canadian employers and employees. Hayes said it released its report 2 months early to draw attention to the fact that 52% of Ontario employees say they are ready to leave their jobs. So just some thoughts on that.
Ooh, okay. Well, for one, it's encouraging that at a time of COVID, I'm assuming that's when this was released, that people would have the courage to be able to do that, which gives you a sense that the economy might be hotter than we are assuming it is, depending on where we sit. So that's very positive. But I think that this current workforce is a little more willing to test. I think the sense of uncertainty, they have grown up with this sense of uncertainty. Yolo in Guelph, I actually had a conversation with one of the professors at Guelph University, and he has this theory that we flip-flop in generations. So my generation is a recession generation, and the kids I raise are probably recession generation kind of kids. And in between, there are boom generations. So if this generation has this appetite, this sense of uncertainty, they actually have an appetite for more testing, more ability to go out there and see if there are other opportunities out there. There's also this conversation around purpose. And I don't know if we have enough time to cover it right here. I'm most happy to address it in Q&A, but it is a significant shift between our generations and the younger ones, where people are willing to give up all the perks that we grew up with in order to live a more purposeful life, one where they either get for themselves more time with their families or more time to be able to do the things that matter to them, that give their lives meaning. And we're also seeing that in their blending of taking on almost portfolio careers, where they might be doing a job in the day, but running an Etsy shop in the evening. So we're beginning to see a whole bunch of other variations on how we work.
Great, thank you very much. We are just about at the end of your time slot. The question that we didn't get to, I'll just mention it now, and then, as I said, we can cover it later. What can we do to better recruit young people that want to stay at our organization and not just use it as a stepping stone to something else? If Dana covers that, great. If not, as I said, we'll kind of circle back to that one. The question has come up in the chat as well about sharing the information at today's webinar. I forgot to mention that at the outset. We are recording this webinar. It will be available to all participants, attendees afterwards. So we'll be sending out a link to be able to access it on our website. So just so that people are aware, you will be able to access all of the content today after the event. Excellent. So thank you very much, Karena. Really do appreciate your time. I know that there's been some good comments and questions here so far, and hopefully if there's more, we don't cover the one that did come up, we'll get the chance to ask them later.
I look forward to reading all these comments now patiently and participating at the end. Thank you very much.
Great.
And once again, thank you to RLB.